Have you ever wondered what happens when a hero is erased from history? When the people who gave everything for their country are forgotten, their sacrifices buried under layers of lies. James Wilson knows that pain all too well. At 80, he's carrying a secret that the government tried desperately to hide, a story that could change everything you thought you knew about the Vietnam War. James, a decorated Vietnam veteran, spent decades living in the shadows, his name stripped from the records. But a chance encounter with a young Navy SEAL, Blake Thompson, leads to a shocking discovery. The symbol on James' arm is the key to uncovering the classified Spectre Group, a unit that was erased because their success challenged the racial prejudices of the military. But what happens when the truth threatens to tear down everything they've worked to protect? Will James and Blake be able to bring justice to these forgotten heroes, or will the powerful forces at play stop them once again? Subscribe to uncover the truth and join the fight for recognition that took 50 years to win. The story of Spectre Group is just beginning, and you won't want to miss a single detail. Let's dive in. The tattoo on James Wilson's forearm stopped Lieutenant Commander Blake Thompson dead in his tracks. Blood drained from Blake's face as he recognized the faded insignia impossible. This elderly black man, quietly eating alone in the corner of Palmetto Fine Dining, couldn't possibly have been there. That insignia, it belonged to a unit that, according to official records, never existed. Blake stood frozen, a sense of disbelief settling over him. The inked symbol that he'd seen in his grandfather's old photographs, a piece of military history long buried by the government. It was impossible for a man like James Wilson, an elderly veteran, to have been there. The mission was never supposed to exist, but it did. James sat calmly, adjusting his collar, eating his meal as though the world wasn't crashing down around him. The restaurant was filled with quiet chatter, the clink of silverware against fine china, but to Blake, the noise seemed distant. His mind raced back to his grandfather's stories of a forgotten group of soldiers, erased from history because their contributions didn't fit the narrative. A group that had saved lives, fought for their country, and never been recognized for it. The Spectre Group. But now, seeing James Wilson, a man who had lived in obscurity for decades, quietly enduring the prejudice of his country and the government he'd fought for, Blake couldn't ignore the gravity of the moment. He had to know more. Blake wasn't the only one who noticed the insignia. The hostess had already seen James walk in. Her practiced smile faltered slightly as she scanned him. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" she asked, though the restaurant was clearly far from full. "Wilson." For one, James replied in his deep, measured voice. Her eyes flicked over him, immediately shifting to a couple entering behind him. The change in demeanor was almost imperceptible, but Blake noticed it. He'd been to enough fancy restaurants to recognize the pattern. James, despite his quiet dignity, wasn't the right kind of person to be seated at one of the coveted window tables. The hostess ran her finger down the reservation book, her smile returning, too warm for the situation, too practiced. "Let me see what we have available," she said, guiding him toward a corner table near the kitchen. There were 6 empty tables with a much better view of the restaurant, but none of them were for James. Blake watched, a cold unease creeping up his spine. As he sat at his own table across the room, he observed James's behavior. Calm, unbothered. The elderly man's posture was perfect. His demeanor was resolute, habits of a lifetime, but Blake could sense the subtle weariness in the lines of his face. A weariness forged not just by time, but by decades of being erased from history. James had been a soldier, a great soldier, a man whose service was hidden beneath layers of governmental bureaucracy, a man whose history had been buried in the same way his people had been treated for generations, without recognition. Blake couldn't help but wonder, what did this man know? What had he seen? And why had the government, the same government that he served so faithfully, turned its back on him? As he sat in silence, his thoughts raced back to his grandfather's journals. Blake's grandfather had been a Vietnam War veteran, like many in his family, but his grandfather had kept secret a piece of his past, something far more significant than he'd ever let on. A unit that had been purposefully erased from history, men who'd saved lives and fought for something greater than themselves, only to be forgotten by those they had fought for. Blake's gaze wandered back to James, now alone with his thoughts, quietly taking in his meal. There was a calm about him that only soldiers had, a quiet confidence born of survival. But why had he been forgotten? When James finally stood up to leave, his coat sleeve brushed against the edge of the table, revealing the faded tattoo once again. The recognition was instant. The symbol, the insignia, Spectre Group. Blake's heart skipped a beat. This was no coincidence. James Wilson wasn't just a forgotten man in a restaurant. He was a man who had been discarded by the very nation he served. He was a soldier, but not the kind that the world remembered. He didn't ask for recognition. He never sought a hero's welcome. He had simply done what he had been trained to do, protect his country no matter the cost. But after serving in a secretive military unit, after fighting for something greater than himself, James returned home to face something far worse than battle wounds. He was met with silence, a complete and utter erasure. He had served in Spectre Group, an integrated special forces unit that performed rescue missions behind enemy lines in Vietnam. A unit that had completed some of the most dangerous, high-risk missions, but was never acknowledged. The military erased their existence. The nation turned its back on them. And so, James learned to live a life of quiet invisibility. He became a master of blending in, of keeping his head down, of fading into the background. He had no choice but to. If he spoke out, if he demanded recognition, the world would remind him where he stood in a system that didn't want him there. It was an uncomfortable truth that James had learned long ago. No one wanted to hear the stories of black soldiers, especially those who had fought for the United States. They didn't want to hear about men who had earned their places on the front lines, men who had fought beside their comrades, only to be dismissed when the fight was over. And so, James sat there in that restaurant, alone. His service was long past, but the stigma lingered. As Blake stood to leave, his curiosity still burning, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to James than just an old man with a tattoo. He had been a part of something far bigger than he had let on, a part of history that no one had bothered to record. Blake felt the pull to dig deeper, to understand the history that had been hidden for so long. It wasn't just a tattoo on an old man's arm. It was a reminder of a history erased, a history that needed to be remembered. Blake Thompson couldn't shake the image of the faded tattoo on James Wilson's forearm. He had seen it clearly now, a fragment of the intricate design that was instantly recognizable to anyone in the military who had ever studied the Vietnam War. The insignia, the mark of Spectre Group. The tattoo was small, barely noticeable at first glance, but to Blake, it was impossible to ignore. The design, worn with age and years of hidden service, depicted a ghostly figure holding two flags, one American, one Vietnamese, the symbols juxtaposed in a way that suggested a unity that the world had refused to acknowledge. Above the figure, there were 12 stars, each one placed in a non-standard pattern arranged in a way that seemed almost deliberate, but also enigmatic. Blake had seen this design before in his grandfather's old military journals, a symbol that was never supposed to exist in any official records. Spectre Group was a name that had never appeared in public. It had been a unit formed as an experiment in military integration during the late 1960s, a team built of both black and white soldiers from various military branches, each chosen for their exceptional skills and potential. Under the leadership of Captain Elijah Freeman, Spectre Group had been tasked with the most dangerous, high-risk missions, ones that traditional forces wouldn't dare attempt. But despite their success rate, an unparalleled 94% in rescue operations and tactical extractions, The unit had been systematically erased, its records destroyed, its members silenced. The insignia, with its 12 stars, was the mark of a brotherhood that never received the credit it deserved. It symbolized a unity that transcended race and prejudice, a unit forged under the most difficult of circumstances, yet one that was never allowed to see the light of day. Its existence had been buried deep in classified archives, never to be acknowledged by the military establishment, because the higher-ups in the government couldn't bear the idea of a black officer leading such a successful operation. Blake's mind raced as he looked at the tattoo on James's arm. His grandfather had spoken of a unit in Vietnam, a group of soldiers who had performed extraordinary feats, saving lives and completing missions that no one else could have accomplished. His grandfather had always referred to them as the Spectres, a nickname for a unit whose name and deeds had been lost to time. Blake had always thought it was a myth, a story lost in the haze of war. But now, staring at the tattoo, he realized it was more than a story. It was real. The insignia was the key, and it was no accident that it had appeared now at this moment. Blake knew that this was no ordinary meeting. The man sitting across from him, James Wilson, was not just an elderly war veteran. He was a living testament to a history that had been suppressed for far too long. Spectre Group wasn't just some forgotten military unit. It was a symbol of everything that had been hidden, covered up, and erased. And now, for the first time in decades, the truth was within reach. Blake was determined to find out more. He needed to know how James was connected to the Spectre Group, what had happened all those years ago, and why this story had never been told. But for that, he needed to earn James's trust. And given the history between men like James, black soldiers who had served their country only to have their contributions erased, Blake knew this wouldn't be easy. The tattoo on James's forearm wasn't just ink. It was the key to unlocking a buried chapter of military history, a story that Blake felt compelled to uncover. As his curiosity deepened, he couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could the truth stay hidden before it was exposed for all to see? And what price would they have to pay to bring it to light? His mind was racing. This tattoo, this old man, sitting across the restaurant, quietly eating his meal, was connected to a part of military history that had been systematically erased. Spectre Group was a unit that had operated covertly in Vietnam, performing rescue missions deep inside enemy territory, rescuing American prisoners, and accomplishing feats no other unit had ever dared to try. But official records had buried their existence, wiped it away as if it never happened. Blake was no stranger to military history, but he had never imagined that one of those men would be sitting right in front of him. He couldn't believe it. The insignia, the one his grandfather had mentioned only in passing, was now burned into his memory. Blake had spent years reading his grandfather's journals, piecing together the untold stories of heroes whose names had been erased. But this man, this quiet veteran in front of him, seemed to be one of those heroes. James Wilson. He had lived through the Vietnam War, served in a unit that was too powerful, too successful for its own good. And now, after decades of silence, Blake had stumbled upon him. Blake's curiosity was growing. More than curiosity, a need for the truth that had been buried for too long. His grandfather had spoken of the Spectre Group, but it was always in fragments, pieces of a story that never fully came together. Now, here it was, a living, breathing connection to that history, sitting alone in a corner of a high-end restaurant, treated like a ghost. It wasn't right. Blake glanced around the restaurant. It was elegant, classy, and full of the kind of people who would never have to worry about their service being ignored or mistreated. But here, in this space, an elderly black man, a decorated war hero, was being subjected to subtle but deliberate discrimination. He could see the difference in the way the hostess treated James. It wasn't loud or overt, it was quiet and careful, the kind of treatment that felt more insidious because it was so subtle. It was the kind of racism that didn't make a sound, but you could feel it in every gesture, every glance. And James, he noticed, didn't react. He didn't complain or protest. He had lived with this kind of treatment for years, decades, and he had learned to survive by not drawing attention to himself. But Blake couldn't let it go. He couldn't let this pass. Not when he knew that this man, this forgotten hero, deserved recognition, deserved to be treated with the respect he had earned, not just as a veteran, but as a human being. Blake's decision was made in an instant. He stood up from his table, his military instincts kicking in. He walked toward James, his mind already working through the steps of what to say. He didn't want to make James feel uncomfortable, but he also didn't want to let this injustice stand. Not today. When Blake reached James' table, he saw the older man glance up at him, his eyes assessing Blake as he approached. James didn't smile, but there was a quiet recognition in his gaze, as if he could sense Blake's intentions before he even spoke. "Excuse me, Mr. Wilson," Blake began, his voice respectful but firm. "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting quite a while. Would you mind if I joined you?" James looked up at him, his face unreadable for a moment. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief hesitation, but then he extended his hand, the gesture calm and deliberate. "James Wilson," the older man said, his voice steady. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm just looking for a quiet meal." Blake didn't retreat. "I understand, sir," he said, his tone still respectful. "But I noticed the service was, well, a little delayed. Might I ask what brings you to Charleston?" James seemed to consider the question for a moment before responding, his voice low and measured. "I've lived here for many years. It's a quiet place." Blake could feel the weight of the unspoken history behind James' words. This wasn't just a random encounter. It wasn't just about a bad table or a slight at a restaurant. This man, this war hero, had lived with his history erased, with his contribution to the country's victory buried beneath the weight of indifference and prejudice. "I'm with the Navy," Blake said, deciding to share a little about himself. "I've been stationed here for a while now. My grandfather served in Vietnam, actually." James' eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Vietnam, and Blake couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the air. It was as if James had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Blake to say the right thing. Blake wasn't sure what had made James react this way, but it intrigued him. The old man wasn't just a veteran. He was something more, something hidden, something that went beyond the service he had given to the country. Blake's curiosity deepened. "I've heard stories about the war," Blake continued, trying to draw James out. "About men who did incredible things but were never recognized for it. My grandfather, he told me about some of the people who saved his life, but their names never made it into the history books." James was silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving Blake. The years of silence, of being ignored, of living in the shadows, seemed to weigh on him. Blake could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. "I've heard those stories too," James finally replied, his voice low. "But sometimes, stories are meant to stay buried." Blake wasn't ready to let it go. "I don't think the truth is meant to be buried, sir. I think people like your grandfather and like you deserve to be recognized for what you did, for what you sacrificed." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands, his fingers lightly tapping against the table. Blake could tell he was wrestling with something far deeper than the simple indignity of being treated like an invisible man in a restaurant. This was about a lifetime of being erased, of being ignored, of being forgotten. Blake leaned in slightly, his voice soft but insistent. "I'm not here to push you, Mr. Wilson, but I think you have a story worth telling. You serve this country, and that story deserves to be heard." James paused for a moment, and Blake saw something shift in his expression. It was subtle, but it was there, a small crack in the armor James had built around himself. For the first time, Blake felt like he was on the verge of something big, something that could change everything. "I'm listening," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're going to have to be ready for the truth. The kind of truth most people don't want to hear." Blake sat back, nodding. He had no idea what kind of truth James was talking about, but he was ready to find out. Whatever it was, Blake knew this was just the beginning. James Wilson stared out the window of his modest home in Charleston, the soft glow of the evening sun casting long shadows across the floor. At 80 years old, he had lived a life marked by silence, avoidance, and an unshakable determination to stay invisible. Every corner of his home, from the neatly arranged bookshelves to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, felt familiar. Everything was in its place, the way he liked it. But that tattoo, the one Blake Thompson had noticed, had stirred something inside him that James thought he had buried long ago. It wasn't just the ink on his arm, though. It was the memories it brought back, memories he had spent decades trying to forget. The men he had fought beside, the missions he had led, the betrayal that had left him and his brothers to rot in the dark corners of military history. For a moment, he had felt like a young soldier again, thrust back into the chaos of Vietnam, into the camaraderie and the fear, into the black and white world where survival was the only goal. James rubbed the faded tattoo on his forearm absent-mindedly, his fingers tracing the edges of the symbol. The ink was worn, just like him, faded, yet still there, a reminder of a past that refused to die, no matter how much he had tried to bury it. He never spoke of Spectre Group, not to anyone. Not even the doctors at the VA knew the full story. To them, he was just another Vietnam veteran, a quiet man with an unexplained limp and a heart condition that had slowly worn him down over the years. To the world, James Wilson was just a face in the crowd, a name lost in the records, a soldier whose story had been erased. But Blake Thompson had seen the tattoo. Blake had seen the symbol that had haunted him for 50 years. And now everything is changing. The young man's words echoed in James's mind. Spectre Group. He hadn't heard that name in so long. No one had. Not since they'd been disbanded, their existence erased from the annals of military history. Spectre Group was supposed to be a secret, a ghost. They were supposed to have disappeared, along with the stories of their triumphs, their sacrifices, and their shame. James had told himself that it didn't matter anymore, that he was too old to fight, too tired to carry the weight of the past any longer. But now, as Blake's words lingered in his ears, James couldn't help but feel the stirrings of something deep inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope, the chance that maybe, just maybe, he could finally tell the world the truth that had been buried for so long. But with that hope came fear of what would happen if the truth came out, fear of the consequences of the powerful people who had buried his story and the stories of the men he had served with. James had spent his entire life avoiding attention, avoiding the kind of scrutiny that would force him to confront the ghosts of his past. And now, with Blake's intervention, the ghosts were beginning to stir. James stood up, his knees creaking as he walked toward the small kitchen. He opened the cupboard and grabbed the whiskey bottle, unscrewing the cap with practiced ease. The smooth burn of the alcohol would help numb the unease gnawing at him, just like it always did. But this time, it didn't seem to work as well. The room still felt too quiet, too heavy. He poured himself a glass and leaned against the counter, staring at the darkening sky outside. The sun had almost completely set now, and the only light came from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. James hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Blake Thompson to come into his life and shake things up the way he had. The young man had intervened in a way that no one ever had. He had seen James's struggle and had refused to let him suffer in silence. For the first time in years, James wondered if maybe he could speak, if maybe he could tell Blake the truth about Spectre Group, the truth about the mission that had never existed, the unit that had never been acknowledged, the sacrifices that had been made and forgotten. But the truth was dangerous. It always has been. James's mind drifted back to the time right after the war, when he was just a young soldier returning from Vietnam. He had been full of hope, full of the idealism that came with serving his country. But the moment he stepped off the plane, everything changed. The welcoming committees weren't there. The cheers weren't there. Instead, there were whispers, sideways glances, and the cold stares of people who saw him as nothing more than another black man who had fought in a war that was already being forgotten. In Vietnam, James had been part of something that transcended the horrors of war. He had fought alongside men from every corner of the world, each of them scarred in their own way, but bound by one common thread: their loyalty to each other, their desire to fight for something greater than themselves. Spectre Group had been an experiment, yes, but one that had proven to be far more than what anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just about the missions they completed, though their success rate had been unmatched. It wasn't just about the blood they shed, the lives they saved, or the countless hours spent deep in enemy territory, performing the kind of operations that no one else had the skill or courage to undertake. No, it was something deeper. Spectre Group was a living testament to the ideal of integration, the idea that men of different races, backgrounds, and experiences could work together in harmony. Despite the barriers of hate and distrust that had defined the history of the United States, in a time when racial tension bubbled to the surface of the military, Spectre Group had defied the odds. They had forged a brotherhood that was more than skin, deep, proving that race was no barrier to excellence, to courage, to leadership. James had been a part of that, and so had the other men, black and white, who had stood beside him. They had learned to trust each other in ways that went beyond words, beyond orders. They had become a family. But when the mission was over, when the smoke cleared and the medals were handed out, the world refused to recognize them. Their sacrifices, their victories, the bonds they had formed, none of it mattered. Spectre Group was erased, its existence wiped from the records as though it had never been. The higher ups in the military, those who sat in their ivory towers, had deemed the success of a fully integrated unit to be too dangerous, too threatening to the status quo. They couldn't allow it to stand. A unit led by a black officer, where black and white soldiers fought side by side as equals, couldn't be allowed to become a symbol of what the military, and, by extension, the country, could be. It didn't fit the narrative that had been carefully crafted over centuries, the one that held white soldiers as the unquestioned leaders, as the true heroes. The country couldn't afford to admit that black men could lead with the same authority, the same effectiveness, and, perhaps, even more compassion than their white counterparts. So, they buried it. They buried Spectre Group's legacy, its accomplishments, and its men. The records were erased, the stories suppressed. The black soldiers, the white soldiers, and their black officer, their names were scrubbed from history, their bravery forgotten, as though it had never mattered. The injustice of it all ate at James's soul. He had been part of something extraordinary, something that had proven, beyond any doubt, that integration worked, that black soldiers could lead with honor and distinction, that men could fight together regardless of race. But to the military and to the men in power, it didn't matter. They couldn't afford to let the truth be known. They couldn't allow Spectre Group to be remembered because it would disrupt the very fabric of the narrative they had so carefully woven. James had lived with that knowledge for decades. He had carried the weight of it every day in silence, never daring to speak of it. But now, with Blake Thompson's probing questions, with the flicker of recognition that had sparked inside him when Blake had seen the tattoo, it was all coming back. The memories, the pain, the anger. The question now was, what would he do with it? Would he continue to let the truth remain buried, or would he finally fight to have Spectre Group's name and the men who had fought so hard for their country be recognized for what they truly were, heroes? James had been forced to live with that for 50 years. He had buried his own memories, locked away the pain of being ignored, of being forgotten. He had built a life of quiet anonymity, never asking for recognition, never seeking the accolades that so many of his brothers in arms deserved. But now, with Blake's questions and Blake's insistence on uncovering the truth, James was faced with a choice he hadn't thought he would have to make. He could remain silent, continued to live his life the way he always had, avoiding the past and the pain it brought. Or he could speak up. He could finally tell the world what had happened, bringing the truth to light. The choice was agonizing. The fear of retribution, the fear of being silenced once again, gnawed at him. But there was also something else, something deep inside him that had been buried for too long, a desire for justice, a desire for the recognition that had been denied to him and his brothers for so long. James turned the glass in his hand, watching the amber liquid swirl inside. He knew what had to be done. He had lived too long in the shadows, hiding from the truth. And now, Blake Thompson had given him a reason to come out of the darkness. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't let it go on. The truth had to be told, no matter the cost. James set the glass down on the counter, his decision made. It was time to face the past, to confront the demons that had haunted him for so long. Time to finally let the world know what Spectre Group had done, what they had accomplished, and why they had been erased. He took a deep breath, standing tall despite the weight of the years that had worn him down. It wasn't over yet, but it would be soon. And when it was, he would finally be seen. The world would finally know what James Wilson and Spectre Group had done for this country, and maybe, just maybe, they would be remembered. James Wilson was ready to tell his story. James Wilson sat in the corner of his modest home, surrounded by old memories, papers, photographs, and dusty files. The light filtering through the windows was soft, as though even the sun was hesitant to disturb the weight of the past. The years had taken their toll on James's body. His once strong frame now showed signs of wear, but his mind remained sharp. His eyes, though clouded with age, still carried the sharpness of a soldier who had seen and endured much. The hands that had once gripped weapons of war now trembled slightly as they shuffled through the papers before him. Each page he turned carried the ghosts of his brothers, soldiers who had fought beside him in a unit that never existed. The Spectre Group, a name erased from history, a legacy buried in the deepest recesses of military archives and governmental cover-ups. But now, Blake Thompson, the young Navy SEAL who had stumbled upon the truth, had reignited something in James. He had not come this far just to turn back. The discovery of Blake's curiosity about the Spectre Group, about the men James had fought beside, and about the tattoo that marked his arm, had changed everything. James knew that Blake didn't fully understand what they were about to do. He didn't yet understand the enormity of the task they faced. But James did. He had lived through the years of silence, the years of suppression. He had learned, through hard experience, that the system would fight back with everything it had to keep its secrets buried. James had seen it all, the lies, the erasure, the manipulation. But the truth had a way of finding its way out, and now that it was in Blake's hands, it wasn't something either of them could walk away from. It wasn't something that could be hidden any longer. For so many years, James had built his life on the principle of silence. It had been his survival mechanism. He had learned early on that in America, especially as a black man who had served in Vietnam, silence was the only way to stay alive. He had been used and discarded by the very country he had sworn to protect. His service had been forgotten, his sacrifices erased from history. And so, he had retreated into the shadows, living quietly, avoiding attention, keeping his head down. It had kept him safe. But Blake had shaken something loose in him. When the young man had stepped in to ensure James was treated with dignity at the restaurant, when Blake had first seen the tattoo, something inside James stirred. The past, long buried, was bubbling to the surface once again, and James could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to drag the ghosts of Spectre Group out of the shadows. It had been too long, the pain too deep. But Blake wouldn't let him go. The young man had a fire in his eyes, a determination that reminded James of the young soldiers he had fought beside, men who had given everything for a country that never gave anything back. Blake wanted justice, and James couldn't help but feel the stirrings of a desire for it too, even if it meant bringing the past crashing into the present. James closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the decision sinking in. If he continued down this path, there would be no turning back. He knew what it would cost. Blake had no idea, but James had lived through the consequences of seeking the truth before. He had seen how the system tore men down, how it silenced them, how it buried their stories under layers of bureaucracy and deception. He had lived with that weight for 50 years. And now, Blake Thompson was about to drag that weight into the light. James had seen the world of military cover, UPS, and classified missions up close. He knew what happened when a soldier stepped out of line. He had lived it. His mind wandered back to Vietnam. The jungle, the heat, the weight of the gear, the constant threat of death hanging over them like a sword. He remembered the faces of the men he fought beside, their laughter, their camaraderie. Spectre Group had been something special, something more than just a military unit. They were a family, built not on blood, but on the shared experiences of war, the understanding that their lives depended on each other. They had been the best, not because of their skin color, but because they had been given a chance to prove themselves together. They had succeeded where others had failed. And yet, when the mission was over, when the dust had settled, the higher, UPS had decided to bury them. The success of an integrated team, led by a black officer, was too much for the military establishment to accept. It didn't fit the narrative they had built, the narrative that kept white soldiers on top. So they erased it. They erased them. That was the truth James had lived with, the truth that had eaten at him for years. He had been part of something groundbreaking, something that should have changed the course of history. But instead, Spectre Group was erased, their records wiped clean, their achievements forgotten. He had always known it was wrong, but he had never had the courage to fight back. Until now, until Blake. The phone rang, pulling James out of his reverie. He glanced at the number. It was Blake. James let out a deep breath before answering. "Mr. Wilson?" Blake's voice crackled through the line, filled with a sense of urgency. "I've found something." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What have you found, son?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with years of hidden anxiety. "It's worse than I thought. The Spectre Group, it was real, Mr. Wilson. But it was covered up. The records, the operations, they were all erased. I'm digging through archives, military records, anything I can find. And there's something else, something bigger. They don't want this getting out." James's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected this for years, but hearing it from Blake, hearing the confirmation, made it all too real. The system wasn't just protecting secrets. It was actively trying to bury the truth. And now Blake was in the thick of it, pulling at threads that were bound to unravel a much larger conspiracy. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time," James said quietly. "But we have to be careful. The people we're up against, Blake, they don't play fair. You're dealing with powers that will stop at nothing to protect their lives." Blake didn't hesitate. "I'm ready, Mr. Wilson. I'm not backing down." The conversation ended, but the tension remained. James sat back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. But with that hope came the realization that everything was about to change. The fight for recognition, for justice, for the truth, would be a long one. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming. But one thing was clear: Blake Thompson wasn't going to let it go. And maybe, just maybe, this time, the truth would win. The quiet hum of the old house was broken only by the sound of the pages turning as James flicked through the folders once again. His hands were shaking, not from the physical toll of age, but from something deeper. His pulse quickened every time he looked at the evidence, the documents, the photographs, evidence of a forgotten history, one that had been buried by those in power. He had spent half a century hiding, keeping his secrets locked away under floorboards and behind walls. Now, Blake Thompson had opened that door, and the truth was spilling out, faster than James could process. James had lived most of his life in silence. He had learned early on that silence was the safest path for a black man in America, especially one who had served in a war, one who had been used and forgotten by the very country he swore to protect. He had kept his head down, ignored the slights, avoided the attention. But now, with Blake's insistence, things were changing. Blake's voice, full of fire and determination, echoed in his mind, pushing him forward, urging him to confront the past. It had taken Blake less than a few days to dig deeper into Spectre Group's history, and already he was uncovering layers of truth that James had long buried. Blake's determination to fight for recognition was something James admired, but it also terrified him. Every step they took toward revealing the truth brought with it the very real possibility of consequences that James knew all too well. He hadn't let Blake see the worst of it, the nightmares, the panic attacks, the memories that flooded his mind in the dead of night, the weight of the years pressing down on him. James had learned to live with those shadows, but now those shadows were threatening to come alive. The system they were up against, the forces that had erased Spectre Group from history, wouldn't give up easily. They would fight back, and James wasn't sure if he was ready for the battle that was about to unfold. The phone rang again, breaking his thoughts. He picked it up, recognizing Blake's number immediately. "Mr. Wilson," Blake's voice came through, steady but filled with a new urgency. "I've found more. I've found evidence, official records, testimony, everything. They've been lying to us for decades." James felt his heart rate spike. "What do you mean? What have you found?" he asked, though he could feel the weight of dread settling in his chest. He already knew the answer. The system had covered up too much for too long. "I've been in contact with some old military contacts, people who were stationed in Vietnam at the time. They knew about Spectre Group, but they were never told the full story. They were told we were failures, that we couldn't succeed as an integrated unit. But that's not true. We proved them wrong. And now we have the proof." James stood up slowly, moving to the window, looking out at the street below. The quiet of the neighborhood was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. Blake was right. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but it also felt like the moment everything could fall apart. He had spent so many years hiding from the truth, burying it under the weight of silence. Now that silence was being shattered. "You need to be careful," James said, his voice low. "This isn't just about uncovering the truth. This is about shaking a foundation that's been built on lies. There are people who will do anything to protect those lies." Blake was silent for a moment, but when he spoke again, his voice was resolute. "I'm not backing down, Mr. Wilson. We have to expose the truth. We have to make sure the men of Spectre Group are remembered for what they did and who they were. They deserve that." James closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had spent so many years avoiding the spotlight, avoiding the recognition he deserved. But Blake was right. They couldn't let this story remain buried. The world needed to know what had really happened, what Spectre Group had accomplished, what they had sacrificed, and what they had been forced to live with. "I'm with you, son," James said, his voice steady now, filled with a sense of resolve. "But we're going to need more than just the truth. We need to be smart. They won't just let us expose them. There are powerful people involved in this, people who have worked too hard to bury the truth." Blake's voice was filled with determination. "We'll be smart. We'll make sure we have all the evidence, every detail. And we'll make sure they can't cover it up this time." James set the phone down and walked over to the small box beneath his bed. The key was in his pocket, cold against his skin. He had never shown anyone the contents of that box, not even his family. Inside were the mission reports, the photographs, the letters, everything that proved Spectre Group had existed. The truth was locked away, waiting for the right moment to be set free. As he opened the box, James felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, anger, but also a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He had lived in the shadows for far too long. It was time to step into the light. But even as he looked at the documents in front of him, a feeling of unease settled in his stomach. This was more than just a battle for recognition. This was a battle for history itself, a battle that would challenge everything he had ever known about the country he had fought for. James took a deep breath and began to sort through the papers, his hands moving with precision, the same precision he had used all those years ago when he was in the field. He knew that whatever happened next, they would be up against something far bigger than themselves. But they had no choice. They had to expose the truth. The men of Spectre Group deserved that much. The house was still. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of papers punctuated the silence. The walls, lined with bookshelves and military mementos, seemed to echo with the ghosts of James Wilson's past. He sat at his small kitchen table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting long shadows across the room. His fingers, calloused and worn from years of service, traced the edges of the papers before him, the pieces of his life that had been buried for so long. James had been at war for more than just his country. His fight was against the world's refusal to recognize his sacrifice, and the price of that fight had been steep. He had given his youth, his strength, and his very soul to a mission that, by all official accounts, had never existed. Now, after decades of silence, Blake Thompson had walked into his life and shattered the walls James had so carefully constructed. The young man was persistent, perhaps too much so, but his belief in justice, his unwavering desire to uncover the truth, reminded James of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It wasn't a feeling he welcomed. Hope had always been dangerous. It had a way of leading people to fight for things they had no business fighting for, like recognition, respect, and honor. These were things James had long ago accepted he would never receive. Yet, as Blake's voice echoed in his mind, insistent, righteous, James found himself wondering if, just maybe, this time, things could be different. Blake had already begun to dig into Spectre Group's history, and James could see the beginnings of something significant. Blake's dedication was apparent, but James also understood the danger of such a pursuit. The truth they were after wasn't just buried, it had been actively erased. The powers that had decided to erase Spectre Group were still in place, and they weren't about to let a few old soldiers upset the status quo. James knew that Blake's pursuit of justice would bring them both into conflict with those forces. They would face opposition from every corner: government officials, military leaders, and perhaps even their own people. James had been silenced for 50 years, and he had learned that silence was survival. But now, there was no escaping the storm Blake had stirred up. James's mind drifted to the memories that had been haunting him for days now: the sound of helicopter blades slicing through the air, the smell of napalm and sweat, the faces of men who had died for a cause no one cared to remember. Those were the memories that lived in the shadows of his mind, the memories that refused to be forgotten. Spectre Group was his family, his brothers in arms. They had fought together, bled together, and, in the end, been forgotten together. The tattoo on his arm, a faded symbol of something the world had chosen to ignore, seemed to burn beneath his skin. That insignia, once so important, was now a relic of a past that the world didn't want to acknowledge. It was a mark of honor, of sacrifice, and of betrayal. The Spectre Group had been special, an integrated unit of black and white soldiers who had learned to work together in the most dire of circumstances. They had proved that race didn't define a soldier's worth, that leadership wasn't a matter of color, but of capability. But despite their success, because of their success, they had been erased. The truth had been buried, and the heroes who had fought for it had been discarded. The military, the very institution that should have recognized their accomplishments, had chosen to pretend they never existed. James had always known this, but it wasn't until Blake had shown up that he realized just how much he had been forced to live in the shadows. Blake's voice came again, louder this time. "We have to expose it all, Mr. Wilson. The truth, everything you did, everything Spectre Group did. It's time to make sure it's known." James's chest tightened, and he stood up, pacing across the room. He stopped in front of the window, looking out at the quiet street below. There was a storm brewing, both inside and outside. The stillness of the neighborhood felt suffocating, as though the world was waiting for something to happen. But James knew better. Nothing would change unless they forced it to. They had to fight for the truth. They had to fight for recognition, for the men who had given their lives to a cause that had never been acknowledged. But what was the cost of that fight? James had spent half a century avoiding this moment. He had avoided confrontation, avoided being seen. He had lived a quiet life, keeping his head down, accepting that some truths were better left buried. But Blake wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let the story die with James and his brothers. The weight of it all pressed down on James's chest as he thought about the consequences. They were both old men now. Time was running out. His health was failing, and Blake's career was on the line. But it wasn't just their futures they were fighting for. It was the memory of the men they had lost, men who had given everything and were erased for doing so. "I've lived with this for so long," James muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "The silence, the waiting. It's all I've known. But now you want me to speak up. You want me to expose everything I've kept hidden." Blake's voice was unwavering, filled with a resolve that James hadn't seen in a long time. "It's time, Mr. Wilson. The world needs to know what really happened. The men of Spectre Group, they need to be remembered. They deserve to be remembered." James turned away from the window, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think of what could happen if they succeeded, if they brought the truth to light. It was both a terrifying and exhilarating thought. But more than anything, it was the right thing to do. "All right," James said, his voice steady. "We'll do it. But we do it carefully. We do it right. We gather the evidence, we expose the truth, and we make sure they can't silence us again." Blake nodded, his expression firm. "We'll do it together." James felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't the calm of acceptance. It was the calm of a man who knew that the battle ahead was one he couldn't fight alone. He had to trust Blake, trust that they could do what they had been denied for so long. As the weight of the task ahead settled on him, James glanced once more at the tattoo on his forearm. It was no longer a symbol of erasure. It was a symbol of resistance. Spectre Group would not be forgotten. Blake sat down heavily at his desk, staring at the file in front of him. James Wilson's life had always been shrouded in mystery. Blake had assumed it was a matter of military protocol, of secrets that must remain buried. But as the pieces of this puzzle started to come together, he realized the truth ran deeper, far deeper than he had imagined. The name Spectre Group haunted him, echoing in his mind, and yet it had been invisible to the history books, erased from every record. How could an entire group of men, whose valor had once saved lives, be obliterated from memory? James Wilson was just one of the survivors, but he was the key, the first door to be opened in a long, forgotten history. Blake couldn't ignore it anymore. The air in his apartment felt heavy with anticipation. The walls seemed to close in on him as he reached for his phone and dialed the first number on his list, Dr. Daniel Reynolds. The former medic who had served in Spectre Group had gone on to become a successful doctor. But there was a history between them, and Blake knew that history was exactly what they needed to unearth. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Reynolds, the man's voice said, unmistakably guarded. "Dr. Reynolds, my name is Lieutenant Commander Blake Thompson. I'm with the Navy SEALs," Blake started, trying to keep his voice calm, though his pulse quickened. "I'm investigating the history of a unit called Spectre Group. You were part of it, right?" The line was silent for a moment. Blake could hear the slow, almost reluctant intake of breath. "Spectre Group." Reynolds' voice cracked slightly. "Who the hell are you to be asking about that?" Blake hesitated. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on the conversation. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't prepared for this level of hostility. "I'm looking for the truth. James Wilson's name is tied to it, and I need your help." "Wilson's still alive?" Reynolds' voice softened, but Blake could hear the skepticism in his tone. Yeah, he's still alive. And I need your help. Document. I know the truth is out there about Spectre Group. You and James are the only ones who can bring it to light. Reynolds sighed deeply. There was a long pause before he finally spoke again. All right, Thompson. You want to know about Spectre Group? You come to Atlanta. But be warned, the ghosts of that group aren't all ready to come out into the light. Blake nodded, even though Reynolds couldn't see it. I'll be there tomorrow. Thank you. As Blake hung up the phone, the gravity of the situation settled into his bones. This wasn't just about uncovering a story. This was about uncovering a conspiracy that had been buried for decades. Spectre Group's legacy wasn't just erased, it was deliberately erased. And the truth, as it always did, was inching closer to the surface. The next day, Blake arrived in Atlanta and made his way to Reynolds' medical practice. It wasn't a grand establishment, but it was well kept, and the patients seemed to trust him. Blake took his seat in the waiting area, surrounded by the hum of quiet conversation and the rustling of newspapers. His mind raced with questions, most of which were unanswered. The biggest question of all loomed over him: what happened to Spectre Group? When Reynolds finally emerged from the back office, Blake could see that the man hadn't aged well. He had the look of someone who had lived too many lives in a single lifetime, carrying too many burdens. He looked more worn down than Blake expected, but his eyes, those eyes still had the sharpness of a soldier. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, Reynolds greeted him, extending his hand. His grip was firm, but there was something in his eyes, a hesitation, perhaps a reminder of the past he had buried deep within himself. Blake stood and shook his hand, feeling the weight of the moment. Dr. Reynolds, thank you for agreeing to meet. Reynolds gestured for Blake to follow him into a small office at the back of the building. As they sat down, Blake could feel the tension in the air. Reynolds wasn't ready to speak just yet, and Blake didn't push. Instead, he let the silence hang between them, knowing that eventually Reynolds would speak. So, you're interested in Spectre Group, huh? Reynolds said after a moment, his tone thick with reluctance. You must know what you're getting yourself into. Blake nodded. I do. I'm not here to make a story out of it. I'm here to find the truth. Reynolds stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. Spectre Group wasn't supposed to happen. They wanted us to fail. They wanted to prove that a fully integrated special forces unit couldn't work, couldn't succeed. And they didn't want it known that we did more than just succeed. We thrived. Blake's heart quickened. This was it, the moment of revelation. What happened, Doc? Why was it erased from the records? Reynolds' face hardened. We were good. We were better than good. But we had a black officer leading us, Captain Freeman, and they couldn't let that stand. He was the best officer I've ever served under, but they didn't want that kind of leadership to be seen by the world. A black man leading a group of soldiers, white and black, into combat and succeeding in ways no other unit had. Blake leaned in, hanging on every word. He could feel the history unfolding before him, like pages of a forgotten book that had been tucked away, ignored for far too long. What did you discover, Doc? What went wrong? Reynolds shook his head slowly. They wiped us out. They erased us from the records. They said we never existed. They buried the truth because it didn't fit the story they were trying to tell. They wanted the world to believe that only white soldiers could lead, could win. And when we proved them wrong, they had to get rid of us. Blake's hands clenched into fists. The anger that had been building inside him now burned hot, spreading through his chest. Who did this, Doc? Who covered it up? Reynolds took a deep breath and looked out the window, as if the answer was written in the distance. Colonel Harrison, now Senator Harrison. He was the one who ordered our disbandment. He's the one who buried us. But it wasn't just him. There were others, higher ups, who didn't want to acknowledge what we'd done. Blake's mind raced. Harrison. The name was a key, a powerful key. He had to find a way to make the truth known. This wasn't just about Spectre Group. This was about the entire military establishment's failure to recognize the courage, the sacrifice, and the history of Black soldiers. "Where do we go from here?" Blake asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside. Reynolds met his gaze, and for the first time, Blake saw the weariness of a man who had spent too many years trying to forget. "We go to the past. We dig up the truth. And we make sure they can't bury it again." Blake nodded. He was ready. They were both ready. Blake Thompson's mind swirled with conflicting emotions as he left Reynolds' house. The weight of the documents he'd seen hung heavily in his chest. The photographs, the mission reports, they were more than just pieces of history. They were proof. Proof of the injustice that had been swept under the rug for far too long. Spectre Group wasn't just a footnote in military history. It was a story of bravery, sacrifice, and an insidious cover-up that had denied men their rightful place in the annals of American military heroism. He'd heard James's story, but seeing the evidence firsthand made everything more real. The paperwork, yellowed and worn, told a story of systematic erasure, names and faces deliberately obscured by the very government these men had fought for. Blake knew there was no turning back. He had to get the truth out, no matter what the consequences would be. And yet, there was a nagging feeling gnawing at him. How far was he willing to go? What would the price be for bringing down such powerful forces? As he got into his car and drove back to his apartment, Blake thought about his grandfather. The old man had spent years trying to uncover the truth about Spectre Group, but the walls of secrecy were too high. Now, Blake had a chance to do what his grandfather had never been able to do: expose the lies, shine a light on the dark corners of history where this story had been buried. It was his responsibility, not just for his grandfather, but for the men of Spectre Group who had sacrificed so much. But as he reached for his phone, he couldn't help but wonder about the bigger picture. Blake had always been a man who believed in the system, in the military, in the idea of justice. But now, after what he had seen, he wasn't so sure. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, could he protect himself, James, and the other men of Spectre Group from the forces that would stop at nothing to keep the truth buried? Blake sat at his desk, staring at the pile of documents in front of him. Each piece of paper felt heavier than the last. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the apartment grew dark, the only light coming from his desk lamp and the faint glow of his phone screen. He had already gone through everything once, but the more he read, the more questions came to mind. How had Spectre Group been able to carry out such extraordinary missions without any recognition? How had they been erased from history so thoroughly? He picked up the phone again and dialed James's number. The older man's voice was slow but strong when he answered. Blake could hear the weariness in his words, a lifetime of burden carried in every syllable. "Mr. Wilson," Blake began, "I need to meet with you again. There's more to this than I thought. I need to understand everything. I think we're close, but I need your help." There was a long pause before James responded. When he spoke, his voice was calm but resolute. "I'm not going anywhere, son. You know where to find me." Blake hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He had been drawn into something bigger than he had imagined. What had started as a simple act of standing up for an elderly man in a restaurant had turned into a fight for justice, a fight that could shake the very foundation of the military and the government. Blake understood the risks, but he also understood the stakes. The truth had to come out. It wasn't just about recognition for Spectre Group anymore. It was about righting a wrong that had been allowed to fester for too long. Blake arrived at James's house later that evening. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, but nobody asked too many questions. James's house stood at the end of a narrow street, a modest, single-story home that looked out of place amidst the newly built condos and upscale developments creeping into the area. Inside, the house was neatly kept, almost clinical in its order. James had always been a man of discipline, and it showed in every corner of his home. The bookshelves lined with military histories, the sparse furniture arranged just so, the absence of any photographs or personal mementos, it all pointed to a life lived in silence, a life spent hiding from the world. "Come on in," James said when he opened the door, his expression neutral, as always. Blake stepped inside, feeling the weight of the moment. He had come to understand James over the past few weeks, not just as a man, but as a symbol of something much larger. James had been erased from history, just like the men he had fought with, just like the missions they had carried out. And now, Blake had a chance to give him back the recognition he had always deserved. The two men sat at the kitchen table, the same table where James had first shown him the photographs of Spectre Group. Tonight, there was something different in the air, an unspoken understanding between them. They weren't just two men talking anymore. They were carrying the weight of an entire chapter of history on their shoulders. "I've been thinking," Blake began, "about what you said before. About how the government buried the truth. Why? Why go to such lengths to erase everything? What was it that they wanted to hide?" James's gaze hardened, the weariness in his eyes giving way to a flicker of anger. It wasn't just about hiding a few names, son. It was about the message they didn't want anyone to hear. Spectre Group was an integrated unit, black men and white men working together, saving lives, doing what no one thought could be done. We proved that integration worked, that it wasn't just some idealistic dream. We showed the world that it didn't matter what color you were. What mattered was your ability to do the job. Blake nodded slowly, absorbing James's words. "But that's exactly why they had to erase you. They couldn't let the world see that a black officer led a team of integrated soldiers and succeeded. It went against everything they believed in." James's eyes never left Blake's, his expression unwavering. "That's right. And that's why I kept quiet. For so long, I kept quiet. Because in America, a black man can't claim victory without someone trying to tear him down. They didn't just erase Spectre Group. They erased us. Our service. Our sacrifice. They made it like we never existed." Blake swallowed hard, the weight of James's words settling deep in his chest. "But it's not true, is it? You were there. You saved lives. And now it's time for the world to know." James's gaze softened slightly. "You sure you're ready for this, son? There are people out there who don't want the story told. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure it stays buried." Blake nodded, his resolve hardening. "I've been ready for a long time. I won't stop until the world knows what you and the men of Spectre Group did." The conversation shifted, and the two men began poring over the details of Spectre Group's missions. James spoke with a calmness that belied the depth of his memories, recounting mission after mission, each one more harrowing than the last. He spoke of the men he had served with, men who had died in silence, whose names had been erased from every record, every obituary, every history book. Their stories had been stolen, and now James was determined to make sure those stories were heard. Blake listened intently, absorbing every detail. He knew that the fight for recognition wouldn't be easy. There were powerful forces at work, forces that had spent decades protecting their secrets. But Blake also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let those forces win. Not this time. "We need to gather the rest of the evidence," Blake said, his voice steady. "We can't rely on just one source. We need everything. Photos, mission reports, testimonies, the whole story." James nodded. "I've kept everything. It's all hidden, locked away. No one ever asked me about it. No one ever cared enough to look." Blake stood up, a sense of urgency sweeping over him. "Then let's get it. Let's bring it all into the light. No more hiding." James sat in the dimly lit room, his gaze fixed on a stack of papers spread across the table. Every sheet, every document, every photograph was a piece of his past, a past that had been buried for 50 years. The tremor in his hand was no longer just a sign of age or heart failure. It was the weight of all those years of silence, of secrets, of battles fought on foreign soil, and the ones fought here at home, against the very country he had served. The old, faded photographs were haunting. Some were creased and yellowed with age, while others seemed pristine, as if they had just been taken yesterday. The faces of the men who had been his brothers, his family during the war, stared back at him, some of them smiling in their military uniforms, others grimacing in pain but still proud. James' hand hovered over one particular photo, his finger trembling as he traced the outlines of the faces. It was a picture of Spectre Group, the unit that had never existed in the eyes of the government. 12 men, 6 black, 6 white, and each of them wearing the same tattoo on their forearms, the symbol of a special operations team that had completed mission after mission in Vietnam, saving countless lives. The more he looked at the photograph, the more his chest tightened. These were his brothers, and they were forgotten. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but it wasn't the disease, it wasn't the fatigue from years of war. It was the weight of what he was about to do. He had spent his life hiding from the truth, living quietly in a world that ignored him, that ignored his service. And now he was about to force it all into the light. Could he really do this? Could he expose what had been buried for so long? The thought of it made his blood run cold. But he had no choice. The younger generation, led by Blake, was counting on him. The weight of the folder in his hand felt heavier than it ever had before, as if it were carrying the lives of the men who had died for the secret. He had seen the faces of those who didn't make it out of the jungle. He had heard their voices in his dreams for years, calling to him, asking why no one ever knew their story. Blake had been relentless. The young man had tracked down every member of Spectre Group still alive, one by one. And now they were here. Together, they were going to make sure the truth was finally told. It had taken a lifetime to reach this point, but now that they were on the verge of exposing the truth, James couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What if it wasn't enough? What if the system, the government, the people in power had too much control? He knew they would fight back, that they would do whatever it took to keep their secrets safe. But he was done being silent. He was done being forgotten. James, Blake's voice broke through his thoughts, and James looked up to find the young man standing in the doorway of his living room. "We're ready. The journalists are in position, and the files are all set. It's time." James stood slowly, his knees creaking with the effort, but his back was straight, his military bearing intact. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the men who had never received the recognition they deserved. This was about bringing justice to those who had been erased from history, all because they dared to prove that men of all races could work together and succeed. As he walked to the front door, Blake fell and stepped beside him. They both knew the risks. They both knew the consequences of what they were doing. But they also knew that they couldn't back down. Not now. James couldn't help but smile as he thought about what Blake had said earlier, that this was their last chance to get it right. It reminded him of the old days, of the missions, of the brothers he had fought beside. Blake had that same fire in his eyes, the same relentless drive that had made Spectre Group the success it was. It wasn't just about following orders. It was about doing what was right even when no one else would. Together, they left the house, the final piece of their puzzle in place. Outside, Blake's car was waiting. James got in, the folder of documents carefully placed on the seat next to him. Blake drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The tension in the car was palpable, the air thick with the knowledge that this was it, the moment of truth. They arrived at the meeting location, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. James stepped out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a war of words, a battle that would determine whether the story of Spectre Group would finally be told. The world would hear the truth about the men who had fought, bled, and died for a country that had turned its back on them. Blake led him inside, and they were immediately greeted by Catherine Lawson, the investigative journalist who had agreed to help them. She was already seated at a table near the back of the cafe, her laptop open in front of her. She looked up as they approached, her eyes hard with determination. "You ready?" she asked, her voice steady. "As ready as we'll ever be," James replied, his voice low but firm. They sat down, and the conversation began. Blake laid out the evidence, one piece at a time. Catherine listened intently, her eyes scanning the documents, her fingers typing notes into her laptop. James could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him as the words spilled from his mouth. Stories of bravery, of betrayal, of men who had been erased from the history books because their success didn't fit the narrative. Catherine asked questions, digging deeper, wanting to understand the full extent of what had happened. James answered each question, his voice unwavering, but the pain was there, just beneath the surface. He had carried this burden for so long, and now it was time for the world to know the truth. Minutes turned into hours as they pieced together the story, confirming the evidence, verifying the details. James could feel the weight of the moment growing heavier with every passing second. The truth was finally being exposed, but the real test was still to come. Would anyone believe it? Would they be able to overcome the powerful forces trying to silence them? As they finished, Catherine looked up at James, her eyes filled with respect. "This is it," she said. "You've done what so many others couldn't. You've brought the truth into the light." James nodded, his expression solemn. "We've done it together." But as he looked out the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that this battle wasn't over. The forces that had kept Spectre Group hidden for so long wouldn't go down without a fight. James knew that they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, James felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out there now, and nothing could take that away. The battle for recognition, for justice, had only just begun. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. As the story of Spectre Group and its forgotten heroes begins to emerge, so too does the profound lesson that James Wilson's journey has revealed. Truth, though buried, always finds its way to the surface. For decades, the story of Spectre Group, an integrated team of soldiers who defied racial barriers and succeeded in ways no one thought possible, was erased from the history books. The government's efforts to suppress it were extensive, but they couldn't extinguish the flame of justice and recognition that these men deserved. James Wilson's courage to finally speak up, even as the weight of his age and health pressed down on him, is a testament to the power of resilience and determination. He fought for his country, and when it failed to recognize him and his brothers for their sacrifices, he didn't stay silent. Despite the risk, despite the decades of secrecy, he understood the value of sharing the truth, not for personal glory, but to ensure the men who fought by his side were not forgotten. The lesson here is clear. The fight for recognition is never just about the individual, but about the collective history and the honor that those who came before us deserve. Sometimes, doing what's right means challenging systems that are built to silence us. It means standing up, speaking out, and never letting the fear of repercussions stop you from seeking justice. Through his relationship with Blake Thompson, James showed us how two generations can come together to uncover the truth, even when the odds are stacked against them. Blake, the young Navy SEAL, didn't just see James as a veteran. He saw a man who had fought for something far greater than any battle on the field, the fight for respect and equality. The connection between James and Blake reminds us that the strength to confront injustice can be found across generations. In a world where heroes are often forgotten, James' story is a powerful reminder that silence is not the answer. The moment you choose to speak, to share your truth, you not only reclaim your own dignity, but help to shape the future of those who come after you. The struggle for justice is ongoing. The fight against racial prejudice and historical erasure continues, but it's never too late to make a difference. The truth is a powerful weapon, and as James Wilson showed, when you choose to wield it, no matter how long it takes, you pave the way for justice to be finally served.